The hum of the old truck's engine was a familiar companion, a low thrumming that usually settled my nerves, a predictable rhythm and a life I'd curated for precision. But today, it felt like an anxious heartbeat, quickening with every mile that peeled away from the city's grid, from the neat rows of workshops and galleries where my meticulous hands found their purpose. My world, for years, had been one of delicate brushes, bespoke solvents, and the quiet reverence for forgotten craftsmanship. I breathed life back into scarred mahogany, coaxed luster from tarnished brass, and resurrected the silent stories held within antique furniture. My solitude was a choice, a necessary companion to the painstaking focus my work demanded. Yet, this journey was different. The inheritance papers had been terse, almost clinical, outlining my unexpected claim to a property I'd never known existed. Blackwood Manor, the solicitor had droned, his voice dry as parchment, a rather substantial, if neglected, estate. Neglected, it turned out, was a polite understatement. The paved road dissolved into a crumbling track, swallowed by encroaching brambles and skeletal trees that clawed at the gray sky. The air grew heavy, damp and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white. The landscape pressed in, a dense, indifferent wall of ancient woodland. Sunlight, what little there was, struggled to penetrate the canopy, dappling the path in shifting, unsettling shadows. Then, through a sudden break in the trees, it appeared. Blackwood Manor. It didn't emerge, it loomed. A hulking, gray stone leviathan, its slate roof a jagged, broken comb against the bruised clouds. Gables jutted like accusing fingers, and a multitude of sash windows, dark and vacant, stared out from under heavy brows of overgrown ivy. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, a monument to a past I knew nothing about, utterly swallowed by time and neglect. My restorer's eye, accustomed to seeing potential, saw only an insurmountable mountain of decay. A rusted iron gate, half off its hinges, groaned a protest as I pushed it open. It tasted like old dust and something else, something. Mineral. I stood for a long moment, hands in my pockets, taking in the full, desolate grandeur. The manor wasn't just old, it felt ancient, burdened by years, by untold stories. The ivy, thick as a man's arm, had not just grown on the stone, it had become part of it, weaving itself into the very fabric of the building, a living shroud. A faint, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left too long, mingled with the earthy dampness, and almost sickly perfume. The massive oak front door, studded with tarnished iron, looked impassable. But the solicitor had provided a heavy, old-fashioned key. With a grunt, I managed to force it into the lock. The tumblers shifted with a groaning clunk that echoed through the entire structure, a sound like a sleeping beast stirring. I pushed. The door, heavy with years of disuse, resisted, then yielded with a drawn-out shriek of tortured wood. A blast of stale, cold air hit me, laden with the scent of mildew, dust, and something else, something deeper, older, like forgotten earth disturbed. The interior was a cavern of gloom. Light struggled to penetrate the grime-caked windows, painting dusty motes in the air like slow-motion embers. My footsteps on the flagstone floor resonated through the vast, empty space of the entrance hall, a grand, imposing chamber that had once clearly seen opulent life. Now, it was just a mausoleum of forgotten elegance. Every surface was cloaked in a thick, insulating layer of dust, an undisturbed testament to decades of vacancy. My plan, as always, was methodical. I needed to assess the damage, understand the scope of the project. But as I moved deeper, past a vast, empty drawing room where a grand piano lay like a broken-backed beast, and through what must have been a dining hall with a table large enough for a banquet, a peculiar sense of unease began to prickle at the back of my neck. I found myself drawn down a narrow, unlit corridor, away from the main public rooms. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper and a series of smaller, unremarkable doors. I tried one, expecting a pantry or perhaps a servant's quarter. The knob turned stiffly, and the door scraped open. What lay beyond was startlingly out of place. It was a room unlike any other in the manor, stripped of any antique charm. The walls were bare, painted a dull, institutional gray. And dominating one entire side was a thick, seamless pane of glass, separating the small, Spartan space I stood in from an identical, equally barren room beyond. A small, built-in bench was bolted to the wall on either side of the barrier. It was, unmistakably, a visiting room with reinforced glass. My breath caught in my throat. What was this doing here? Who would have built such a thing in a private residence, and why? This wasn't just neglect, this was something far stranger, far more deliberate. The determination that usually fueled me began to waver, replaced by a growing, unsettling curiosity. This house held more than just forgotten furniture, it held secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. The old truck finally sighed to a halt, its engine ticking and cooling as I cut the ignition. The abrupt silence that followed was heavier than any city noise, a profound, ancient hush that seemed to absorb all sound, even the rustle of the dry leaves under my boots. I stood for a moment, letting the stillness seep in, my eyes tracing the skeletal branches of the oaks that clawed at the slate roof of the manor. It wasn't just an old house, it was a hulking, silent sentinel, watching. I decided to start small, to impose some order on the chaos. The main drawing room, with its peeling wallpaper and dust-shrouded furniture, felt too overwhelming for a first foray. Instead, I chose a smaller study off the central hall, a room that seemed to have been spared the worst of the decay, though still thick with the scent of mildew and forgotten things. My plan was simple: clear out the debris, assess the woodwork, begin the meticulous cleaning process that would, eventually, bring the room back to life. My toolkit, a leather-bound symphony of chisels, mallets, brushes, and solvents, felt reassuringly solid in my hands. I laid out my most frequently used items on a drop cloth spread over a warped oak desk, a set of carving knives, a small jeweler's loupe, a pot of beeswax polish, and a specialized scraper for delicate finishes. Precision was my creed, and organizing my tools was the first step in any project, a ritual that calmed the buzzing unease the manor had stirred. I started on a section of wall paneling, carefully scraping away layers of grime and old varnish. The work was slow, methodical, the kind of repetitive motion that usually allowed my mind to drift, to anticipate the beauty hidden beneath the neglect. But today, my focus felt frayed. I kept glancing up, a subconscious scan of the room, as if expecting to see something I hadn't noticed before. The motes of dust dancing in the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy windows seemed to coalesce, to shift in the corners of my vision. The first true disturbance was subtle enough to be dismissed. I'd set my smallest bristle brush down beside the beeswax tin, turning to fetch a finer grit sandpaper from my case. When I turned back, the brush wasn't there. My brow furrowed. I was certain I'd placed it right beside the tin. I scanned the desk, then the floor around my feet. Nothing. A sigh escaped me. Must have been my own absent-mindedness, a habit I prided myself on not having. I found it eventually, tucked under a stack of old journals on a nearby bookshelf, a place I definitely hadn't put it. A momentary pang of irritation, then I shrugged it off. New surroundings, new distractions. As the afternoon wore on, a different kind of sound began to prickle at my awareness. Not the groaning of old timbers, which I expected, but something more deliberate. A faint, almost imperceptible thump from upstairs, followed by a soft, dragging sound, like something being moved across a bare floor. I froze, scraper poised. I listened, straining to catch it again. Just the oppressive silence, punctuated by the faint hiss of the wind outside. Just the house settling, I muttered, the sound of my own voice surprisingly loud in the stillness. But the explanation felt thin, like a worn fabric. These weren't the familiar creaks of an old building, they had a different cadence, a sense of purpose. Later, while meticulously cleaning a carved rosette on the mantelpiece, I caught a fleeting movement in my peripheral vision. My head snapped up, my gaze locking onto the empty archway. The light from the window was fading, casting long, distorted shapes, playing tricks on my eyes. I rubbed my temples. This solitude, this profound quiet, was clearly getting to me. I was manufacturing phantoms from dust and fading light. I felt watched. Every time I bent over my work, the feeling grew, compelling me to straighten, to turn, to scan the empty room, the hallway beyond. The light outside had almost completely vanished, and the internal gloom of the manor deepened, becoming a tangible presence. I decided to pack up for the day, the unsettling events having thoroughly eroded my focus. As I gathered my tools, I spotted a loose floorboard near the hearth, one I hadn't noticed before. Curiosity, a dangerous companion in a place like this, tugged at me. I knelt, prying it up with the edge of a chisel. Beneath, not dust or cobwebs, but a shallow cavity. Inside, a small, tarnished brass key rested on a scrap of yellowed parchment. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded, but I could just make out a single, unsettling word observation. Clutching the key, a fresh wave of unease washing over me, I stood and looked around the study. My eyes, now accustomed to the dimness, caught sight of a peculiar, almost hidden door, disguised within the intricate wall paneling I had been working on. It was flush, barely visible, but the brass key felt warm in my palm, as if vibrating with a silent invitation. I pressed the key into the lock. It turned with a soft, metallic click that echoed too loudly in the suffocating quiet. The door swung inward, not into another dusty room, but into a narrow, unlit corridor that smelled sharply of ozone and something metallic, something sterile and wrong. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. It illuminated a short passage that opened into a stark, anachronistic space. There, bathed in the anemic glow of my flashlight, stood a room unlike any I had ever seen in a private residence. It was small, barren, entirely devoid of decoration, and dominated by a single, imposing feature, a wall of thick, reinforced glass, stretching from floor to ceiling, separating this space from an equally empty room beyond. And perhaps, to watch them. Clutching the brass key, its cool weight a stark contrast to the sudden clamminess of my palm, I turned back to the wall. The faint outline of the hidden door, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, now seemed to pulse with a subtle energy. It wasn't the intricate carving that caught my attention, but the slight discoloration of the wood grain around what I now recognized as a tiny, barely there keyhole. My fingers, surprisingly steady despite the tremor in my gut, traced the seam. The key slid in with a soft, metallic whisper. No resistance, no click, just a smooth, almost oiled entry. I twisted it. A soft thunk echoed from deep within the wall, like a heavy latch disengaging. I pushed gently. The panel, instead of swinging inward, slid sideways with a low, grating sigh, revealing not a grand chamber, but a narrow, cramped alcove. The air that spilled out was thick and stale, smelling of dust, mildew, and something else, a faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. I flicked on my headlamp, its beam cutting through the gloom. The alcove was small, barely wide. Enough for me to squeeze into, and perhaps 4 feet deep. It was utterly empty save for a single, leather-bound ledger resting on a rough-hewn shelf carved into the stone. The leather was dark, almost black, and dry to the touch, flaking slightly under my fingertips as I carefully lifted it. No dust motes danced in the air, which struck me as odd. It was as if this space, though sealed, had been somehow preserved from the normal decay of the manor. I carried the ledger back into the study, placing it on the heavy oak desk. The light from the window, though fading with the afternoon, was enough to see the title, embossed in faded gold leaf, The Accounts of Blackwood Manor. But these weren't financial records. They detail the history of the manor that was far removed from any architectural blueprints or property deeds I'd uncovered. The early entries were innocuous enough, detailing harvests and repairs. But as I turned the brittle, yellowed pages, the tone shifted. Dates became sporadic, the handwriting more agitated, sometimes trailing off into frantic scribbles. Her name, she says, is not what it once was. The cook found her weeping over a forgotten recipe, a dish he had made for 40 years. Another, from 1892, simply stated, "The West Wing is sealed." This wasn't local gossip, it was a chronicle of something deeply unsettling, something that preyed on identity. The entries grew increasingly fragmented, detailing the slow, insidious erosion of memory, of self, among the manor's occupants and even some local residents. Names were forgotten, faces became unfamiliar, and people spoke of a pervasive emptiness where their own pasts should have been. My eyes scanned a page detailing the disappearance of a stable hand. "He went to fetch water," the entry read, "and returned not knowing his own name, nor the faces of his kin. He left by dusk, walking north, never to be seen again." A sudden, sharp headache bloomed behind my eyes, a dull throb that pulsed with the rhythm of my reading. I rubbed my temples, trying to clear the fog. What was I doing? I'd picked up a chisel earlier, hadn't I? Or was it a brush? I'd been working on the wainscoting? No, the fireplace mantel. Or had I just finished lunch? The thought was fleeting, dismissed as quickly as it arrived. Too much isolation, too much dust, too much grim history. My mind was playing tricks on me. I took a deep breath, pushing the vague sense of confusion away. This ledger was a goldmine of information, however disturbing. I returned to the entries, determined to find some pattern, some explanation. The ledger spoke of a sealed room, a visiting room with reinforced glass, built in the manor's deepest cellars, where those afflicted with the forgetting could be observed. It detailed a desperate attempt to study the phenomenon, to understand what was happening to the people. The glass, it said, was to prevent it from reaching them directly. The final entries were almost entirely illegible, a frantic scrawl that bled through the pages, ending abruptly with a single, smudged word, empty. I closed the ledger with a soft thud. I felt a strange disorientation, a flicker of unfamiliarity with the oak grain of the desk, the precise angle of the window frame. They was this my desk? They was this my house? No. Of course, it was. I was Reed. I was restoring Blackwood Manor. A thick pane of glass separating me from something. No, from someone. A figure on the other side, indistinct, yet undeniably there. My breath hitched. Where had that come from? I shook my head, trying to dislodge the phantom image. Just exhaustion, I told myself, the morbid tales from the ledger getting to me. The thought of that visiting room with reinforced glass had clearly planted itself too firmly in my subconscious. It had to be. I ran a hand over my face, the stubble rough beneath my fingers. I was tired, profoundly tired. The manor was a vast, silent maw, and I was spending too many hours alone with its secrets. I needed a break, some fresh air. It wasn't a word, just an impression, a sensation of something vast and ancient stirring, roused by my intrusion. Chisel? Brush? Wainscoting? Fireplace? The specific details of my work had vanished, leaving only a vague impression of labor and a profound sense of disorientation. I'd woken on the floor of the drawing room, a half-empty mug of cold tea beside me, the morning light slicing through a dusty window. My neck ached. This wasn't just fatigue. A cold dread settled in my stomach, a familiar companion these past few weeks. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them by scraping paint. I spent the next few days not on restoration, but on investigation. The manor held a small, dusty collection of its own history, ledgers, old letters, a few brittle local newspapers tucked into a forgotten desk drawer in the library. My fingers, usually so precise with delicate antiques, fumbled through the yellowed pages. The earliest records were sparse, detailing property transfers, tax receipts. But as I delved into the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a pattern began to emerge, fragmented and unsettling. A faded newspaper clipping from 1823 spoke of the peculiar malady that afflicted the manor's then owner, a respected local magistrate. He was described as having lost his faculties entirely, his memory a sieve, his identity a shifting sand. The article ended with a brief mention of his removal to a private residence for specialized care, a euphemism I instinctively understood. No further mention of him. Just a blank space where a life used to be. Another account, a handwritten letter from a solicitor dated 1878, detailed the sudden, unexplained disappearance of the entire Beaumont family, husband, wife, and 2 young children. No trace, no struggle, simply gone, the solicitor had penned in a trembling hand. The property was left unclaimed for years, the letter stated, before eventually falling into the hands of a distant relative who promptly sold it. These weren't just stories, they were echoes. The memory loss, the fading identity. It felt too close to what I was experiencing. Was this manor a place where people simply ceased to be? The research was exhausting, but I couldn't stop. The more I read, the more the lines between my own reality and the manor's past began to blur. One night, I woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat. I'd been dreaming, but it wasn't a dream I recognized as my own. I was a different man, a woman perhaps, standing in a large, echoing hall, the walls covered in peeling frescoes. My hands, though not my own, felt smooth, delicate, adorned with rings I'd never seen. I tried to speak, but the words that came out were in a language I didn't understand, full of harsh consonants and rolling vowels. It belonged to the person in the dream. When I finally jolted awake, the taste of foreign fear still lingered on my tongue, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't remember my own name. Reed. My name was Reed. The waking hours offered little respite. I'd whirl around, chisel in hand, only to find the empty air of a forgotten room. The memory gaps grew wider, more alarming. I'd set out to clean a specific section of the library, only to find myself hours later in the conservatory, a half-finished cup of coffee cooling on a dusty windowsill, no recollection of how I'd gotten there or what I'd been doing. Once, I found a page torn from one of the historical texts, crumpled in my pocket, its contents entirely new to me, despite having just spent days poring over those very documents. Had I read it before? Had I torn it? I couldn't remember. I began to doubt everything. Was I truly losing my mind? Was the isolation of the manor finally getting to me? The next night, the dream returned, but this time it wasn't a dream. I was standing, fully awake, in a stark, sterile room. Before me stretched a vast panel of reinforced glass, thick and impenetrable. On the other side, a figure sat. It was me, or at least, it looked like me. My clothes, my hair, the subtle scar above my left eyebrow. But the eyes. The eyes were wrong. A tremor ran through me. I pressed my palm against the cool, hard surface of the glass, a desperate attempt to connect, to understand. The figure on the other side mirrored my movement, slowly, deliberately, its hand rising to meet mine. But as its fingers splayed against the reinforced glass, they were not my fingers. They were longer, thinner, ending in nails that were too sharp, too black. And the face behind the glass began to shift, to ripple like water, its features elongating, its mouth stretching into a silent, gaping maw. I was trapped, frozen, my reflection not my own, my identity dissolving into the terrifying, shifting image on the other side of the reinforced glass. Chisel? Brush? Wainscoting? Fireplace? My eyes snapped open. The air was cold, sterile, and smelled faintly of antiseptic, a stark contrast to the dust and damp earth of the manor. I wasn't in my bed. I wasn't even in the manor. My head felt heavy, a leaden weight on a pillow that offered no comfort. Above me, a fluorescent light hummed, casting a pallid, unwavering glow on a ceiling of acoustic tiles. I pushed myself upright, my limbs stiff and uncooperative. I was seated in a metal chair, bolted to the floor. Beyond the glass, another identical table and chair stood empty, bathed in the same harsh light. How? Why? The last thing I remembered was. What was the last thing I remembered? My reflection in the glass stared back at me, a pale, disheveled stranger with wide, panicked eyes. My hair was matted, my clothes wrinkled. I looked like I'd been dragged through a hedge backward. This wasn't right. This wasn't my life. Then, a figure appeared on the other side of the glass. They walked in with a measured, deliberate pace, a man in a plain, gray uniform. His face was unremarkable, his eyes devoid of expression. He sat down in the chair opposite mine, his hands resting flat on the table, palms down. He said nothing, simply observed me through the thick barrier. The words felt alien, distant. The man didn't respond. He merely tilted his head slightly, a gesture that was both dismissive and unnervingly inquisitive.
He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small, laminated card. He held it up, pressing it against the glass. The word printed on it, in bold, stark letters, was "Read." My name. My identity. A strange relief washed over me, quickly followed by a fresh wave of confusion. Why did he need to show me my own name? Did he think I'd forgotten? The thought was absurd, yet a tiny, insidious doubt began to burrow its way into my mind. Had I? The man put down the card and picked up another. This one read, Manor. My manor. The decaying house, the dust, the scent of ancient wood and damp earth. The work. The restoration. I was working there. He picked up a third card. This one was blank. He held it up, then slowly, deliberately, he drew a single, crude line across its center with his finger, as if dividing it. Then he flipped it over. The back was also blank. He repeated the gesture, tracing the imaginary line. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't even making eye contact now, his gaze fixed on the blank card. But the message, somehow, was clear. Division. Emptiness. What are you trying to tell me? I demanded, my voice gaining strength, fueled by a rising surge of panic. Where am I? Why am I here? He finally looked at me, his eyes like chips of flint. He lifted another card. This one had a single, bold word, forget. Forget. The word struck me like a physical blow. Forget what? The previous night? My own name? Was that what was happening? Was I forgetting? My mind raced, snatching at threads of memory, trying to weave them into a coherent tapestry. My parents. My childhood home. The smell of sawdust in my grandfather's workshop. My first restoration project, a delicate mahogany desk. They were there, but they felt thin, brittle, like old parchment threatening to crumble at a touch. He put down the forget card and picked up one last card. This one was different. It wasn't a single word. It was a photograph, faded and indistinct, of a room. It looked like the library in the manor, but not as I knew it. It was richer, grander, filled with ornate furniture that I'd never seen. And in the center, standing by a roaring fireplace, was a man. His back was to the camera, but even from behind, there was something familiar about his build, the cut of his coat. My breath hitched again. Who? Who is that? The man in the uniform slowly, deliberately, turned the card around, revealing the back. On it, scrawled in an elegant, looping script, was a single name, Read. But not my face. Not my room. Not my life. The reinforced glass seemed to press in, the sterile light intensifying, burning into my eyes. I'm an antique restorer. I live in the manor now. I inherited it. I'm Reed. I pointed to myself, then to the card with my name. That's my name. But that's not my picture. That's. His voice, when it came, was a low, dry rasp that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, seeping through the reinforced barrier, bypassing my ears and settling directly in my skull. Are you? He asked, the single word echoing in my mind, stretched and distorted. Or are you merely a collection of borrowed recollections? A convenient vessel for a history that was never yours? He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. And you? You are merely the latest iteration, a blank canvas waiting to be painted over with the past. My hands flew to my head, gripping my temples. The room spun. I am me. My memories are real. My life is real. But even as I shouted the words, the conviction behind them wavered, a fragile flame flickering in a hurricane. Who was I? And which of these terrifying, borrowed realities was truly mine? The line between myself and the manor, between my memories and its history, had not just blurred, it had shattered. My hands flew to my head, gripping my temples. The room spun. The reinforced glass warped, reflecting not my face, but a succession of blurred, unfamiliar visages, each one distinct, each one a different man, but all of them, somehow, were me. The reinforced glass wasn't just reflecting, it was showing me, forcing me to witness a grotesque parade of identities that were, unsettlingly, almost mine. A wave of nausea hit me, and I stumbled back, catching myself on a cold, metal table. This wasn't right. Nothing about this was right. The certainty that had once grounded me, the quiet confidence in my own history, was dissolving like sugar in hot water. I needed out. I spun, my gaze sweeping the small, confined space of the visiting room with reinforced glass. The door, a heavy slab of steel, stood impassive. I'd come in here, I remembered that much, but the exact mechanism for opening it now eluded me. My fingers fumbled for a handle that wasn't there, then for a push bar, a button. Nothing. Just smooth, cold metal. Hello? Is anyone there? My voice sounded thin, reedy, swallowed by the thick walls. No answer. Of course not. Who would be? The place had been empty for decades, or so I'd thought. The only other way out was the reinforced glass itself, which was clearly impenetrable. Through the distorted view, I could make out the dusty, unoccupied chair on the other side, a mirror image of the one I'd been sitting in moments ago. The space beyond looked just as empty, just as abandoned. Taking a shaky breath, I forced myself to calm down. There had to be another way out of the manor itself, if not this specific room. I retraced my steps, or tried to. The hallways outside the visiting room with reinforced glass seemed to stretch, subtly shifting. Was this the way I'd come? The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern I thought I remembered, now looked like a repeating tapestry of eyes, all staring. My vision was playing tricks, or the manor was. I found the main entrance hall, or what I believed to be it. The massive oak door, which I'd often struggled to close properly, now seemed firmly shut, its bolts thrown with an iron finality. I tried the handle, twisting and yanking, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if it had been sealed from the outside, or perhaps from within the very fabric of the house. Only a faint, persistent hum, like a sleeping generator, vibrated through the timber. Next, the windows. They were all latched, painted shut, or simply too high to reach without a ladder. And even if I could open one, the overgrown ivy and thorny bushes outside looked like a barricade, an organic, living wall designed to keep things in, not out. I tried a window in the dining room, scraping my nails against the peeling paint, trying to force it upwards. It shuddered, groaned, but held fast. This was more than just old house decay. This felt deliberate. My phone. My lifeline. I pulled it out, thumbing the screen. No signal. Just a stark SOS only at the top. I tried calling a colleague, a fellow restorer I sometimes worked with. The phone just clicked, then went dead. I tried another number, a general contact I used for emergencies. Same result. Then, as I stared at the screen, the battery icon, which had shown a healthy half-charge, blinked once, then went completely black. Dead. Just like that. I shook it, pressed the power button repeatedly, but it remained a useless brick in my hand. This wasn't just bad luck. This was too coordinated, too absolute. This was the entity, wasn't it? Cutting me off. Isolating me. I stumbled through the drawing room, towards the back of the house, where I knew a small servant's entrance led to the overgrown gardens. Maybe, just maybe, that door would be less robust. But as I rounded the corner into the narrow passage, I froze. The passage itself was gone. In its place was a solid wall, patched with plaster, indistinguishable from the other walls in the hallway. It was as if it had never existed. But I knew it had. I'd walked through it just yesterday. I even remembered the loose floorboard just before it. I knelt, running my hand over the floorboards. Smooth, solid wood. No loose board. Event, a sudden, sharp crack echoed from above, directly over my head. I flinched, looking up. A section of the ceiling plaster, directly above where the passage should have been, fissured, a spider web of cracks spreading rapidly across the painted surface. A fine dust sifted down, landing on my hair and shoulders. It was a warning, a physical manifestation of the house's defiance. My mind reeled. Was I losing it? Was my memory truly this unreliable? Or was the house itself shifting, twisting, mocking my attempts to navigate it? This wasn't just about getting out, it was about holding on to what little sanity I had left. Then, my gaze fell upon something half hidden beneath a dusty, overturned chair in the corner of the hallway. It was a small, leather-bound journal. It looked old, the cover scuffed and worn. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. The leather felt strangely warm, almost alive. I flipped it open, the pages brittle and yellowed. The handwriting inside was spidery, faded ink, but legible. It was a diary. Reveal/discovery. The first entry I could clearly read was dated almost a century ago. Day 17. The walls move. The doors betray. I cannot find the way out. My own face in the mirror is not my own. I see him. He wants my thoughts. This wasn't just some forgotten resident's ramblings. The journal wasn't just a relic, it was a testament. A record of another victim. Another read. Or perhaps, another me. I squeezed my eyes shut, the journal clutched tight in my hand. The quiet hum of the house seemed to deepen, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards, through my very bones. It wasn't just keeping me in, it was consuming me, slowly, deliberately. The journal wasn't just a relic, it was a mirror. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the faded ink on the brittle page. This wasn't some abstract philosophical musing from a bygone era. This was a direct, horrifying premonition, laid out for me, for anyone brave or foolish enough to find it.
I leaned closer, the faint smell of dust and decaying paper filling my nostrils. The dim light filtering through the grimy panes cast long, shifting shadows across the room, making the empty chairs look like silent, hunched witnesses. The entries weren't chronological, jumping from one hand to another, some elegant, others a frantic scrawl. It took time, piecing together the fragments, like restoring a shattered antique. But as I read, a picture began to form, sickeningly clear. The first hint of its ancient origins was buried deep in a section describing the manor's original construction. Not a foundation stone, but something unearthed beneath the foundation. A strange, smooth, obsidian-like object, humming with a low, almost imperceptible vibration. The journal referred to it as the seed, an entity not born, but awakened. It wasn't organic in the way I understood life, but a primal, elemental force, linked to the very earth itself, dormant for centuries until disturbed. Then came the entries detailing its parasitic nature. It didn't consume flesh or blood. It was far more insidious. One account, written in a precise, almost clinical hand, described a slow fading. First, the small things, it read, the placement of a teacup, the name of a distant cousin. Then, the faces. My wife's smile, my son's laughter. They become indistinct. Like photographs left too long in the sun. The entity, the author deduced, wasn't a predator in the traditional sense, but a siphon. It latched onto the threads of consciousness, a psychic leech. My own experiences flashed through my mind, the forgotten details, the faces I couldn't quite place, the growing uncertainty about my own past. It was happening to me. I was becoming one of those sun-bleached photographs. It fed on memory and identity. This was its sustenance, its lifeblood. One particularly harrowing entry, penned in a shaky, almost childish script, detailed the final stages. I see a man in the mirror. He has my eyes, my hair. But he is not me. He knows things I do not. He remembers a life that is not mine. Where did I go? Who is this? Stranger? This was the exact horror I glimpsed, the truth behind the reinforced glass. The entity didn't just take memories, it replaced them, weaving a new, horrifying tapestry of false existence, slowly subsuming the host until nothing of the original self remained. It manufactured delusions so complete, they became the new reality for its victims. The air in the visiting room felt thick, heavy with the weight of forgotten lives. The journal's final, most desperate pages, written by an unnamed keeper, a person who had seemingly resisted the complete erasure, laid bare the ultimate cost and what it truly demands. The keeper hadn't been able to destroy the seed. It was too deeply embedded, too ancient. Instead, they had found a way to appease it, to put it back into dormancy. A complete and willing surrender of one's entire being, consciously given, not merely taken piecemeal. Only then will it be sated, and slumber once more. My eyes widened, the journal slipping slightly in my numb grip. A willing surrender? It didn't want to just steal my mind, it wanted me to give it my mind, my soul, everything that made me read. It wanted a complete, conscious sacrifice of identity, a willing erasure, a final, deliberate act of self-annihilation. And only then would it release its grip on the manor, on the world. The reinforced glass now felt less like a barrier and more like the transparent wall of a cage, and I, Reed, was the chosen offering. The air in the visiting room with reinforced glass was thin, sterile, and smelled faintly of something metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. On the other side, a colleague, his face a blur of concern I could barely focus on, simply watched me. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't quite catch, or perhaps words I simply didn't want to hear. My ears hummed, a low, persistent drone that seemed to originate from deep within my skull, not from the ventilation system above.
It once.
I cleared it, a dry, painful scrape.
Not just consumption. A conscious offering.
A surrender. The words felt foreign, not quite mine, as if I was quoting something I'd read long ago, something I was only now beginning to understand. The journal, the faint, faded script, the horrifying implication. My colleague leaned closer, his brow furrowed. He tapped the glass gently, a sound like a distant, hollow knock.
Read? Are you all right?
All right.
I had to focus. My plan.
It was fragile, a spiderweb spun across a chasm, but it was all I had left. I have to give it what it wants, I continued, ignoring his question. My gaze drifted past him, through the blank wall behind, into the echoing, memory-starved halls of the manor.
Not the real me. My hands trembled, and I clenched them into fists, nails digging into my palms. The slight pain was grounding.
I needed to remember the edges of myself, even as they frayed. The entity fed on memories, on identity, on the very essence of who a person was. It wanted to consume a life, to absorb its narrative, to become it. And it wanted that narrative given willingly. A life, meticulously crafted, every detail burnished, every joy amplified, every sorrow given meaning.
An antique, you could say. My finest restoration yet.
My colleague frowned, his head tilting. He spoke again, his voice muffled, a phantom vibration against the glass.
He probably thought I was raving. Maybe I was. A better read, perhaps.
One who traveled the world, who loved deeply, who achieved greatness, who left a legacy. I pictured it, a vibrant tapestry of experiences, a life so compelling, so complete, that any entity would find it irresistible.
A feast. It would be a construct, a magnificent lie, and the sacrifice?
The sacrifice was in its creation. To make it real enough, I explained, leaning closer to the glass, my reflection staring back at me, a gaunt stranger with haunted eyes, I have to believe it. Every moment, every sensation, every emotion. I have to become that person, that other Reed, so completely that the entity, when it reaches for my mind, will take him instead. The weight of it settled on me, heavier than any physical burden. To create a new self, a false self, so convincingly that I would lose the original in the process. To offer myself up, not as a sacrifice to be devoured, but as a vessel for a decoy, a ghost of a life, a beautiful, empty shell. It was a kind of suicide, a voluntary erasure of the Reed who stood here now, talking to a blurred face through reinforced glass. It will be a willing surrender, I said, a grim smile touching my lips. But it won't be my surrender. It will be the surrender of a phantom. To cut the thread. The thought of severing the connection, of finally being free, was a brief, blinding flash of hope. I would have to descend into that carefully constructed delusion, inhabit it, feel it, make it real enough to fool an ancient, malevolent intelligence. My colleague on the other side of the glass was now speaking more urgently, his hands pressed flat against the barrier, his face a mask of distress. He was probably calling for help, for some kind of intervention. But I didn't care. His words were just noise, background static to the roaring storm in my own head. The entity had wanted a conscious sacrifice of identity. It was going to get one. Just not the one it expected. The real Reed, the one who remembered the musty smell of old books and the precise angle of a dovetail joint, would be buried deep, a seed waiting to sprout, or perhaps, simply to rot. I was gambling everything. My very essence, my sanity, my future. But if it worked, if I could trick it, then perhaps, just perhaps, the manor could finally be free. And I, too, could find a kind of peace, even if it meant becoming a stranger to myself. I was ready to begin. The air in the manor had grown thick, not with the familiar scent of dust or decaying wood, but with something far more insidious, the tangible weight of manufactured memory. I stood in the main hall, the very heart of this ancient deception, and drew a slow, deliberate breath. My plan, fragile as spun glass, was ready. I had to become the delusion, if only for a moment, to dismantle it from within. I closed my eyes, letting the familiar scent of old paper and linseed oil, usually my anchors, become fluid, shifting. The walls around me seemed to ripple, then dissolve, reforming not into the familiar patterns of the manor, but into a stark, cold space. When I opened my eyes, I was there. A room, small and claustrophobic, with a single, battered metal table bolted to the floor. And separating me from whatever else existed in this fabricated reality, was a sheet of reinforced glass. This was my chosen arena, the place where I believed I could face it, contained. A presence solidified on the other side of the glass. Not a form, not a shape, but a pressure, like a hand pressing against the inside of my skull. It began subtly, a whisper that wasn't sound but thought, a suggestion. Reed. Who is Reed? I gripped the edge of the metal table, knuckles white. I am Reed, I asserted, my voice a rasp in the sterile air. My name, once a solid foundation, began to feel like a foreign word. Was it Reed? Reed? The letters blurred in my mind's eye. I saw flashes, a child's hand gripping a worn wooden toy, a young man meticulously sanding a chipped armoire, the quiet satisfaction of a perfect repair. But the images were fractured, like photographs torn and haphazardly pieced back together. The faces in them were indistinct, the details hazy. No, that's not right, I thought, fighting the rising panic. That's my memory. My life. Then came the smells, not of the manor, but of 1,000 other places, all clashing, sickening. The sweet rot of forgotten fruit, the metallic tang of an old penny, the acrid bite of burnt sugar. My stomach lurched. The reinforced glass, my supposed barrier, seemed to ripple, its surface distorting the faint light. I could feel its gaze, 1,000 unseen eyes boring into me, dissecting me. It wasn't just taking memories, it was scrambling them, twisting them into grotesque parodies. I saw my childhood home, but the windows were boarded with rough, unpainted planks, and the scent of my mother's baking was replaced by the cloying sweetness of decay. My first workshop, a haven of order and purpose, dissolved into a chaotic junkyard, tools rusted and broken, wood splintered and worm-eaten. You are a fraud. Your hands are clumsy. You destroy more than you create. Each word was a tiny shard of ice, piercing through the carefully constructed narratives of my life. I remembered the pride I felt in restoring a delicate porcelain figurine, the painstaking hours, the eventual triumph. But the memory now flickered, replaced by an image of the figurine shattering, dust motes dancing in the air as it disintegrated.
My own hands, resting on the cold metal table, felt alien. They were these the hands that had brought life back to countless forgotten objects? Or were they just hands? Generic, unspecialized, detached. I traced the calluses on my palm, trying to connect with the familiar ridges, the slight roughness of skin hardened by years of careful work. But even that sensation was dulled, distant, as if my nerves were failing. The glass before me started to hum, a low, resonant vibration that I felt in my bones. On the other side, the air shimmered, coalescing into fleeting, grotesque impressions, a gaping maw, an ancient eye, a writhing mass of indistinct limbs. It wasn't trying to scare me with images, it was trying to overload my perception, to break my mind's ability to process. "Your name is not Reed," a voice boomed, deep and resonant, yet still without origin. "It is a sound, an empty vessel. You are the dust of what once was." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the assault. But the voices were inside my head now, not just external. They were dissecting my past, pointing out every moment of doubt, every insecurity. The time I chipped a valuable antique, the argument with my father over my chosen profession, the loneliness that sometimes settled in the quiet hours of restoration. Each memory, once a part of my tapestry, was being unpicked, thread by thread. That Reed was a story I'd been told, a character I'd mistakenly inhabited. The manor, the antiques, my craft, they were all props in a play I didn't write. My own hands felt alien, too large, too small, not quite right. This was it. This was the core of its power. I was becoming nothing. But then, through the relentless assault, a single, unwavering image asserted itself. Not a memory, not a story, but the undeniable, visceral truth of my craft. The smooth, cool grain of polished mahogany beneath my fingertips, the faint, sweet scent of beeswax, the precise, almost surgical focus required to reattach a delicate inlay. It wasn't a narrative that could be twisted, it was a physical, undeniable sensation, etched into my muscle memory, into the very fibers of my being. It was the feeling of doing, of creating, of restoring. The sound, harsh and real, cut through the manufactured chaos. "My name is Reed." I yelled, the words tearing from my throat. "I restore. I fix what is broken. I give history back its form. I am not a fraud. I am a craftsman." The entity recoiled, or at least, the immense pressure in my head lessened for a fraction of a second, like a giant hand momentarily loosening its grip. The shimmering on the glass intensified, as if my assertion had struck a physical blow, a direct hit to its spectral form. It was trying to drown me, but I was finding my way to the surface, gasping for the air of my own truth. I focused on that feeling, the wood, the tools, the patient work. I began to mentally list them, one by one, each item a defiant act of self-definition. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that vibrated through the reinforced glass, making it hum violently, a deep, guttural thrum that resonated in my chest. Cracks, fine as spider webs, began to spread from the edges of the pane, creeping inwards with agonizing slowness. It was pushing back with everything it had, trying to shatter my resolve, to break the very structure of this mental battleground. But the cracks, I realized, were not just a sign of its power, of its destructive force. They were also a sign of its struggle, its desperation. My resistance was having an effect. I was fighting for more than my life. I was fighting for the very right to be Reed, to exist as an individual.
And in this sterile, glass-divided room, the battle for myself was far from over. The glass groaned, the cracks spiderwebbing further, but it hadn't shattered. Not yet. I was still here. I was still Reed. The hum was the first thing. It wasn't the creak of old timber, or the whisper of the house, or the entity's sickening static. This was mechanical, sterile, a sound designed to soothe or perhaps to numb. I was sitting in a chair. Not the overstuffed armchair from the manor, or the stiff-backed dining chair. This one was molded plastic, bolted to the floor. My hands rested on a smooth, cool surface that stretched before me, a table of the same dull material. Well, from everything else. The visiting room with reinforced glass. The words came to me, not as a memory, but as a label dropped into an empty space. Like someone else had named it, and I was simply repeating it. I ran a palm over the table's surface. It felt solid, unyielding. My fingers traced the faint lines where the glass met the frame, a barrier I knew, instinctively, I could not breach. What had happened? A flash, a surge of power, a terrible assertion. My own name, spoken like a weapon. Reed. The entity had recoiled. I remembered that much, a jolt of triumph, sharp and fleeting as a spark. It was a distant echo, like hearing a story about someone else's victory. The shimmering, the pressure, the drowning sensation. It had been trying to drown me, to erase me. And I had fought back. I had won. Hadn't I? My gaze drifted beyond the glass. A hallway, long and featureless, stretched into a vanishing point. No windows, no doors save. For the one I knew led out, guarded, locked. A figure stood at the far end, indistinct against the muted light, observing. A warden, perhaps. They didn't move, just a silhouette of quiet vigilance. Their presence was a dull weight, a confirmation of my containment. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, feeling the faint vibrations of the facility's constant thrum. I tried to remember my mother's face. Nothing. A blank. Not even a blurry outline, just an empty space where a face should have been. My father? My childhood home? The image of the manor, vast and menacing, rose unbidden, overlaying whatever house I might have once inhabited. No, that wasn't right. The manor was a recent acquisition. I had lived somewhere else before, but where and with whom? The entity had fed on memory and identity. It hadn't just taken the bad ones, the traumatic ones. It had taken everything. I knew I was Reed. I knew I was an antique restorer. But who was Reed, beyond those labels? What were his joys, his sorrows, his private jokes, his favorite scent? They were gone. All gone. I remembered the feel of a particular chisel, the grain of an ancient mahogany, the scent of aged beeswax. Those skills, the tactile knowledge, remained. My craft, my meticulous work, was etched deeper, perhaps, than my personal history. But it had left its indelible mark. It had carved out pieces of me, leaving behind phantom pains where memories used to reside. It was like waking up to find a limb missing, but the limb was my very self. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure a single, vivid personal memory. A birthday party, a first love, a pet's name. Anything. My mind was a vast, echoing cavern. There were no specific images, only a profound sense of loss, like mourning a person I could no longer recall.
My breath hitched. Was this my face?
I knew it intellectually, but there was no spark of recognition, no deep, innate sense of self that connected me to that image.
The warden shifted, a barely perceptible movement at the end of the hall.
They were watching, always watching. They saw a man who had survived, perhaps, but they couldn't see the emptiness behind my eyes, the silent screaming of a mind that had been scoured clean. It had not killed me, but it had certainly taken my life. I was Reed, the antique restorer, a craftsman without a history, a man who had forgotten how to be human. And the tension, the quiet, relentless tension, was knowing that I would carry this scar, this profound absence, for whatever remained of my days. It permeated everything, a sterile counterpoint to the chaotic memories that flickered at the edge of my awareness.
My vision slowly cleared.
I was in a room, small and stark, bathed in an artificial, soft white glow that offered no shadows, no corners for the eye to rest. The air tasted of faint antiseptic and something else, something metallic and cold, like clean, worn steel. I sat in a bolted-down chair, my hands resting on a smooth, cool surface that felt like polished stone. Across from me, separating my space from another, was a thick pane of reinforced glass, floor to ceiling, stretching the entire width of the room.
A visiting room with reinforced glass. The phrase echoed in my mind, sterile and precise.
For a long moment, I just sat there, breathing in the filtered air, letting the hum vibrate through my bones. I remembered the final confrontation, the surge of something. A desperate, primal force that I'd unleashed, or perhaps merely witnessed, as the house seemed to collapse in on itself, consuming the entity, or so I'd believed. A hard-won victory, a narrow escape. I was free. The thought brought a weak, watery surge of relief. A woman, dressed in a simple, muted gray outfit. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her face unlined, but her eyes held a weariness that seemed ancient. She carried a small, flat tablet, its screen glowing faintly. She didn't smile, but her expression wasn't unkind, just observing. Like a distant relative at a funeral. I pushed myself up from the chair, the movement stiff, my muscles protesting.
Hello?
My voice was a rasp, and used.
Where am I? What happened? The manor. It's gone, isn't it? The thing, the entity, I fought it. I think I destroyed it. The woman on the other side didn't speak.
She merely tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. Her eyes, I noticed, were a peculiar shade of pale blue, almost translucent.
They seemed to look through me, not at me.
I need to leave, I continued, my voice gaining a desperate edge.
I have to get back to my work. My life. I have so much to do. So much to remember. The last part caught in my throat. Remember what, exactly?
My mind felt like a sieve, the details of my past before the manor, before the entity, slipping away like fine sand. Names, faces, places, they were all there, theoretically, but without the emotional weight, the texture. Like reading a list of facts about a stranger. The woman raised a hand, pressing it gently against the reinforced glass.
We've been trying to help you. To piece things together. Help me?
I scoffed, a dry, humorless sound.
I'm fine. I'm free. I just need to get out of this place. I need to restore my life.
My memories, he sighed, a soft expulsion of air that seemed to carry the weight of years.
Read the manor. It was found utterly derelict. Empty. There was no sign of you. I was there. I was fighting. I was clearing the house, restoring it. I found the hidden rooms, the carvings. The entity. It was feeding on me, on my past. It wanted to erase me. The woman's expression remained placid, but a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, crossed her pale eyes. Your family reported you missing months ago. When you were found, you were disoriented. You spoke of things that simply aren't real. Fantasies. Delusions. Delusions? The word hit me like a physical blow. No. You don't understand. It was real.
The hum, the static, the way it stole my memories, replaced them with its own twisted reflections.
I won. I got away.
I pounded my fist on the cool, hard surface in front of me.
The sound was flat, deadened.
The hum, I noticed, seemed to intensify for a fraction of a second, then settled back into its rhythmic thrum.
Read, the woman said, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. We believe you've suffered a severe break. The stress of inheriting the old property, the isolation. It overwhelmed you.
I stared at her, at the reinforced glass, at the featureless room.
If what she said was true, if I hadn't escaped, if the entity hadn't been destroyed, then where was it? And what was I?
They were my hands, calloused from years of delicate work, but they felt distant, alien.
I flexed my fingers, watched them move.
A memory surfaced, sharp and clear, tracing the intricate pattern of a forgotten carving in the manor's hidden crypt.
But was it my memory, or one the entity had left behind, like a calling card? The hum. It wasn't just in the room. It was in me.
A deep, resonant vibration that had become part of my very being, a constant companion. It wasn't the sterile hum of a facility, it was the hum of something else, something vast and ancient and present.
I looked back at the woman through the glass.
My supposed victory, my escape, it had been nothing more than another layer of illusion. The entity hadn't needed to destroy me entirely, it had simply needed to rewrite my ending. The manor, the entity, the battle, the escape, it had all been a meticulous, elaborate stage play. A performance designed to convince me, and perhaps others, that I was still Reed, still human, still me, but the hum. It was my hum now. The dull, constant thrum of something that had taken root, something that saw through my eyes, processed my thoughts, and wore my name like a borrowed garment.
The reinforced glass wasn't there to keep me in.
It was there to keep it contained. And the woman, with implacid face and ancient weariness, wasn't trying to help Reed. He was observing the successful integration. It was not a smile of triumph, nor of despair. It was the smile of something that had finally achieved a twisted, final victory. And the true horror was, I couldn't remember what it felt like to be anything else.